All right, everybody, we are broadcasting live. So, for those of you that have just joined us, we are broadcasting about a very specific topic, and that topic has to do with apologetics. Not only does it have to do with Christian apologetics, it has to do with a certain person's apologetic, and that certain person is C.S. Lewis, and his apologetic as written through his book, Mere Christianity. Now, Mere Christianity is a book that has several chapters, and Steve Shives, one of our guests, broke down the first chapter. He broke down the whole book, actually, but in one of his videos, he broke down, oh my goodness, I want to kick myself right in the butt because I always do this. And there I go. So, that having been said, I always turn the audio off, or I leave the audio on YouTube when I broadcast. That being said, so Steve Shives, the guest, he broke down the first chapter of Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, and I'm hoping that most, if not all, the people that are watching right now got a chance to watch that on Steve Likes to Curse, his channel on YouTube, because we're going to be talking about his breakdown of that in Atheist Reads Mere Christianity Chapter 1. And we have with us, of course, Steve Shives. We have with us Ozzy. We have with us Ilana. And hopefully throughout this hangout we will have more people dropping in. I have revealed the hangout link on many platforms. If people need the link, please private message me, and I will provide it to anybody who is interested, who is watching, who would like to join this. And we're going to try to break down the critiques that Steve gave to the apologetics that C.S. Lewis gave in the first chapter of Mere Christianity. So, panelists, how are y'all doing tonight? Don't jump in at once.
Great, thank you.
Very well, thank you.
Excellent.
Excellent.
So maybe the first way to go is I'm going to take a wild stab and maybe say that some of the people that are watching didn't get a chance to digest every last morsel of the argument that C.S. Lewis laid out, nor the critique that you were able to argue against the argument laid out by C.S. Lewis, Steve. So would you be able to maybe just summarize, or maybe even for the sake of discussion, put out the first chunk or nugget that C.S. Lewis puts forward, so that we can get this discussion started?
Sure. Well, the first chapter of Mere Christianity, and really the first section of the book, the greater part, if I remember correctly, is an extended presentation of the moral argument. And for those of you watching who aren't familiar with the moral argument, it basically boils down to because first of all, morality exists. Morality is a thing that exists in the world, and because we have morality, we can argue from morality to God, because God must be the source of our morality. In order to be able to tell if something is right or wrong, if something is good or bad, we have to have an objective, absolute standard telling us what those concepts mean, what they are, how they relate to each other, and God is the source of that standard. So for chapter 1 of Mere Christianity, Lewis essentially just lays that out. He makes the argument that morality exists, that it is a thing, that when we argue with each other, or as Lewis puts it in his writerly voice, when we quarrel with each other, when two people quarrel, the point is that they're trying to convince the other party that they are right and the other party is wrong. And how can we have an argument over who is right and who is wrong unless we have an agreement over what right and wrong are? How can we have a standard by which to judge right and wrong unless we have an absolute standard which comes from God? So that's chapter 1. That's the first part of the moral argument, establishing that morality exists, that it's objective, that it's agreed upon, that we don't just argue from personal preference, we appeal to higher standards. And then from that point forward, Lewis goes on to argue that the source of this morality, and in fact the source of this morality is God, and that the very existence of this morality is evidence that that God exists.
So can we all agree that even if people don't recognize C.S. Lewis as the source of this style of argument, that this style of argument is pervasive in apologetics today? The fact that an absolute morality is being adhered to is an argument used by Christians of all flavors, shapes, and sizes across the boards, right? So, I mean, I've had it used against me several times, where it's like, well, if you're arguing against something, you must have an absolute standard by which you're holding somebody against to know that they are wrong. So, I mean, that logic, the logic by which C.S. Lewis is laying out in this first chapter of Mere Christianity is something that is pervasive, like I said, in the apologetics that exist now. And even though people might not be able to say, yes, I'm using the apologetic that C.S. Lewis uses in chapter 1 of Mere Christianity, they're using the apologetic that C.S. Lewis uses in chapter 1 of Mere Christianity. So I mean, so this is very popular, and I love the fact that C.S. Lewis lays it out so elegantly, as compared to how ham-fistedly it is somehow sometimes laid out in today's parlance. Does anybody have any experience with this particular argument in forums or attempts to explain things in their own personal experience? Ozzy or Ilana or Steve?
Yeah, I've had discussions with people about this argument. Sometimes it was sort of presented as C.S. Lewis's argument, and it was sort of presented sort of the way he would present it in the kindness that he did. I mean, it's been years since I've read the book, and unfortunately, I got my wires crossed about when this was supposed to take place, so I actually didn't see Steve's presentation about the argument, so I apologize for that. But yeah, I've had discussions about this with people before, but it's an argument that's enormously popular, and I think it's one that's intuitively very appealing, because a lot of people who have read no apologetics and just sort of drunk in sort of arguments for God kind of intuit their way to that argument. So you'll sometimes get very inchoate, sort of rough and ready, approximate versions of Lewis's argument, and I don't know if it's just because it's so intuitively plausible to people that people sort of independently converge on some version of Lewis's argument, or if Lewis's argument has sort of permeated Christian culture to such an extent that everyone has sort of drunk it in without realizing, that's where it comes from. Although, I mean, Lewis is not the first person to present this argument. I mean, it goes back even further than that. So.
No, but the fact that he popularized,
yeah,
I think there's something to be said for that. And also, it's, I mean, from my perspective, it seems as elegantly and eloquently as he presents it, it seems so easily defeated by saying, I can tell that something is incorrect by merely using a referent, and that referent does not need to be absolute. Like, and who is to say that the referent that I'm using needs to be absolute, other than a Christian that is making that assertion? You know what I mean? Like, in order for me to say that something is incorrect just means to say that it is not comporting to a referent that I'm comparing it to. But there's nothing saying that that referent is somehow absolute in any way, shape, or form, which seems to be the argument that C.S. Lewis seems to be, or Christian apologetics seems to be putting forth. So I'm curious to hear now, like, since this is the argument that's put forth, what are the arguments that the panelists here see as valid arguments against what C.S. Lewis is putting forth?
Well, I see a whole bunch of things, but it might be advantageous if we articulated, maybe get Steve to sort of present the the steps in the argument so that everybody else will know, and it would refresh my memory, because I think I remember how the argument goes, but it's been a long time, and I don't want to get it wrong.
Excellent.
Well, the basic argument, and you're right that Lewis does present it far more elegantly than it usually is presented. The argument itself, the moral argument, is still used. William Lane Craig still uses it all the time. It's a part of his standard act. His sort of opening act at debates is to present basically the classical arguments for the existence of God, and he goes through the cosmological argument, and he goes through the argument from design, and he goes through the moral argument. And it basically goes, absolute morals exist, and the source of these absolute morals must be an omnipotent, universal, transcendent God. Because we have morality, therefore God exists. And one of the first problems that I detected with it, when I was reading Lewis, and also when I would hear other people make this argument, is just the idea that even if you believe that we have to have some sort of absolute, universal, transcendent moral standard to appeal to, even if that's what you insist, that there's no reason that has to be God. And in fact, there are atheistic philosophers who accept the idea, or are at least more receptive to the idea than some of us are, that there are absolute transcendent moral standards that exist outside of ourselves, that we don't just make up, but that these standards just exist. And it's similar to sort of, I've compared it sometimes to they're like laws of physics. They're laws of morality that are just there, and when a moral being attains a level of intelligence and sentience and empathy, these are the standards that we become aware of, and these are the standards that we appeal to. No God necessary. So that's the first argument, is that it doesn't, the existence of God doesn't automatically follow from the acceptance that absolute morals exist.
But I mean, he has an argument for why he thinks that there has to be a God, right?
Yeah. Let me scroll through my notes here,
Okay.
because I didn't actually watch my own video either, and it's been some time since I read the book. Lewis actually makes that comparison. He actually compares the moral law to natural law, to scientific laws of physics and laws of chemistry. But of course, to him, those are all evidence of God as well. To a naturalist, it wouldn't look that way. You would say, well, the laws of physics are part of the nature of the universe, so maybe the laws of morality are as well. But to Lewis, he sees it as all part of the God-made universe. And the reason why he says that there must be a God is that God is the one who ultimately decides what is right and wrong. There has to be, and Lewis is thinking, there has to be an ultimate sort of standard. There has to be an ultimate arbiter. So it's not just a matter of opinion. It's when God says it, or when God says this is moral, this is immoral, that makes it binding on all of us. And if it were not that way, then according to Lewis's thinking, it would not be truly an absolute binding moral law.
Yeah, but he's got another argument, sort of that's operative in the background there, and that is that the moral law. Well, I mean, the argument is something like there is a moral law. Okay, like that. Just he thinks that we all presuppose. I don't want to use the word presuppose, because that's a little larded right now in this discourse. But I mean that we all act. We all assume that there is a moral law. When we argue with one another, when we quarrel, as he says, we're not just trying to sort of convince one another that Coke is better than Pepsi or something like that. We're not just articulating our preferences when we argue, when we say that such and such a thing is wrong. We're trying to say something much more than that. And I think he's right about this. And let me state my biases clearly up front. I am a moral realist myself. I think there is such a thing as an objective moral order. I would say absolute and certainly not transcendent, but there's an objective moral order. So I'm very sympathetic to sort of some of what Lewis says here. This first part, that when we talk about morality, we don't talk as if we're just expressing our preferences or our tastes. There's something more going on there. If you listen to how people talk about morality, it's very, very different than when they talk about their preferences and their tastes. And efforts or attempts to cash out people's moral intuitions and their moral talk in terms of mere preferences, or what's sometimes called a non-cognitivist approach, I think they run into problems. They run afoul not just of people's intuitions, but people will emphatically deny that that is what they are thinking and trying to say when they condemn something or when they commend something morally. So he thinks that if you just look at how people talk, that they're at least assuming that there's a moral order of some sort, what he calls a moral law, and that it seems to be universal. That when we say that such and such is wrong, we're saying that it's wrong. Period. It's wrong for everybody. It's not just wrong for me. You know, even when you say that something is wrong in a specific circumstance, you're saying, look, for anyone relevantly like this in this relevant circumstance, it would always be wrong. So even if you factor in situational factors that are relevant, and every moral system does this, you're still saying it is in fact completely wrong. So as he sees it, if there's a moral law, there has to be a moral lawgiver, because in his view, morality is about laws. It's you obey laws, and laws have to be handed down. And if there's a moral lawgiver, well, then there's got to be. If there's a moral lawgiver, like the moral lawgiver can't be in the world. It's not us. We're not given us these laws. There's no agreement between us when it comes to these laws. So, and when you look around in the world, moral facts, as he envisions them, aren't like physical facts. We don't bump into them. We don't discover them with science, he thinks. So it must be that they're somehow outside the universe. They're beyond the universe. And so therefore, there's got to be something beyond the universe. And this is what points to God. This is how he sort of gestures towards God in this argument. So that's sort of, sorry, Steve, I'm long-winded, but that's where I was going to when I was sort of asking about, what is his argument to try to get to God here. It's that there's a universal moral law, and if there's a universal moral law, there has to be a lawgiver, and if there's a lawgiver, it can't be in the universe. It's got to be outside the universe. It's got to transcend, and well, that can only be God. So,
but in the same sense, I mean, if I can start interjecting a critique right here,
sure.
In the same sense that like Mandelbrot patterns and fractals are beautiful patterns built into chaos, can't we say that within individual differences of subjectivity, there are threads of continuity that don't have to be seen as dictated from the outside, but just but just that threads of continuity of overlap of something that and bringing it into what we're talking about now, like things that I consider to be morally valid, things that Steve sees to be morally valid, things that Ozzy seems to be morally valid. Even though we might have things that are different, there are things that have overlap. And if we were to take that on a population level, there would be threads of continuity running through all of these individual differences. And isn't there validity in seeing that, but not seeing that as, well, the reason why that is because they're absolute, and the reason why they're absolute is because they were impressed upon us by some outside force. And seeing it differently as the reason why they exist is because they are emergent properties from our humanness. And so I kind of want to throw that into the conversation.
Well, let me try to sort of argue how Lewis might do it.
Go ahead.
And this is hard because it's been a long time since I read Lewis. But, okay, I think what he'd want to say is something like, look, what you're pointing to is something that like someone like even Thomas Aquinas would agree to, that there is in the world natural law. God created the world. He created a good world. He created us in the world. He created us for the world. He created the world for us. And if you start raping and pillaging and stealing and lying constantly and stuff like that, society's going to break down. There are just facts about us and the world that make it such that it's just going to be in your rational self-interest and in social interests to do certain things and avoid certain things. So, in every culture, no matter how they define marriage, they can define marriage differently, but however they define marriage, adultery is going to be a no-no. And however much they value, truth and honesty, they're going to value truth and honesty to some degree, because you can't even communicate if everyone's lying all the time. And people are going to value people who keep their word, and people are going to value people who don't harm one another, and loyalty. And there's going to be certain virtues and values and no-nos and things you must do and obligations, just from rational self-interest and for the purposes of social cohesion. But he would say, but there's still something missing there. Sure, that's going to happen, and so we would expect to find that even if there was no moral lawgiver. But we don't have a duty to condemn people. People aren't culpable if they violate these principles, right? I mean, there's all kinds of things that I do in my life that are in my self-interest, but we don't say that when I'm doing what's in my self-interest, or even if it's in the interest of society at large, that it's a good thing. I mean, if I'm a job creator, if I start a company and I start employing people and stuff like that, that might be a very good thing for me, and it might be good for my employees, and it might be good for society at large. But we don't say that was the morally right thing to do, right? There's something missing there. There's an ingredient missing there, he would say. And if I do something that's sort of against my own self-interest or against the interests of broader society, that doesn't necessarily make it morally blameworthy. So he thinks, look, there's something important in this moral dimension that's absent when you try to cash things out in terms of sort of human nature and our interests and commonality. So everything that you pointed to, Chris, that explains why we get along as well as we do, whether or not there's a God, he would say, yeah, it's true, we could get along pretty well, but there'd be something missing still. And what's required there is some being that disapproves and has forbidden certain things, or has required certain things, made certain things obligatory. And it is on that basis that we ourselves incur an obligation to uphold and condemn and prohibit and oblige certain things. Does that make sense?
Sure. And then I would say, cool. Then why does that work for bonobos as well?
Well, I mean, do you think bonobos? I mean, he would say, well, in the case of bonobos or other social animals, the reason they're going to get along with one another is the same reason we get along with one another. Like, I think Lewis would say, look, if there was no God and no moral law,
bonobos have social consequences. When somebody breaches a social law amongst bonobos, there aren't social consequences. So, and unless you're willing to say that God made bonobos in their image, upon which they need to follow the moral laws upon which God gave them, then I don't know why they would follow them.
Oh, okay, hang on. I didn't make myself clear. Lewis would not deny, this is what I was trying to say, but I didn't get this out right. Lewis would not deny the kind of factors that you and I recognize as necessary for getting along in the world. In other words, I think Lewis would say this. St. Thomas Aquinas would say this, in fact. I mean, if there was no God, and we were all just here, people would get along pretty much the way they do right now.
But I thought I was addressing that missing component that you said, which was like altruism and consequences.
No, there'd be altruism anyway. Like, if there was no God on Lewis's account, you'd still have altruism. You'd still have loyalty and stuff like that. It's just that these would just be patterns of behavior. There's altruism in insects. I mean, if you want to see altruism, forget bonobos and humans. I mean, look at the social insects like bees and ants. They have like extraordinary altruism. You can get an entire colony that'll sacrifice itself for the queen. So he would say, no, this, you find altruism in these kinds of sort of pro-social behaviors in non-human animals. We find them in us. There are perfectly natural causes for this and reasons for this. So his argument isn't that the reason we're moral is that there's a moral law. No, the reason certain behaviors are moral and not merely just how we do things, the reason we're inclined to categorize certain patterns of behavior as moral in the first place is because there's a moral law. We don't do those things because there's a moral law. We classify them separately as moral acts. But I mean, if I decide to do this, scratch my head, that's neither moral nor immoral. Well, why? Well, it doesn't matter. Though people do scratch their heads, and there's all kinds of things that we just do, including look after our children and you look after the sick and wage war against other people. And certain things are considered right and wrong, but what makes them right or wrong isn't that we do them, and it isn't even that they're pro-social or anti-social or anything like that. It's that there's a moral lawgiver that has said these things are right and these things are wrong. These are obligations. These are forbiddances, and that's the difference. So I don't think he would deny that there's the same kind of behavior in bonobos as in us, but I think he'd say in the case of bonobos, let's say bonobos lived exactly like us, exactly like us. He might say, yeah, well, morality doesn't apply to them and it applies to us, and the relevant difference is that God has demanded things of us and not of them.
So are you saying that according to Lewis, humans would actually behave exactly the same way even if there wasn't a moral order? Is that what you're saying?
Not exactly, not exactly. Almost the same. The differences would come in that once people think something is a moral action, they'll behave differently than if they don't think something is a moral action. They'll avoid doing certain things because they believe that they're wrong, but the idea is a lot of maybe 90%, let's say, I'm just going to throw out a number. Let's just say 90% of what we do right now, Lewis would say, yeah, that we'd be doing that anyway, with or without a God. But none of it would be moral or immoral. We would just be doing it because it makes sense for us to do it. But it would have nothing to do with morality. What makes us take those same actions and class them under the headings right and wrong has to do with the fact that there's a moral lawgiver. But for that moral lawgiver, it's just like everything else we do. It's like scratching. It's like going to the bathroom. It's like feeding your face. Neither good nor evil, just how we do things, just like insects.
But that's not what most theists who believe in divine command theory would believe. They would believe that we wouldn't do any of these moral things if we didn't have the moral order, right?
Yeah, but that's true. Let me just qualify this one thing because I hadn't quite finished answering your question. Remember, I said it's almost the same. It's not quite. I mean, let's assume that Lewis would say, 90% of the behavior wouldn't change in the world if there was no moral lawgiver. But that last 10%, well, that might be because, and again, don't harp on the numbers. Nothing rests on the numbers here. But let's say that last 10% of how we behave differently because there's a moral law is because we believe there's a moral law. Once you take on board the idea that there's a moral law, suddenly you'll be able to recognize certain actions as wrong and certain actions as right that you wouldn't have otherwise. For instance, if you believe that prayer is good and an obligation, well, if you didn't believe in the moral law and you didn't believe in a God who gave you this moral law and this obligation to pray or something like that, you wouldn't do it, right? So there are certain behaviors, certain actions, right, that you undertake because you believe there's a moral law, but most of what we do, he would say, well, we would do that anyway. He wouldn't have a problem with that. I mean, and this is a very old idea. That's sort of what Thomas Aquinas talked about with natural law. Now, with respect to the average person who believes in divine command theory, a lot of people have an idea that the only thing that keeps us from just going totally barbarian on each other is that there's a God who gave us orders, and if we didn't have that, we would have no sense of right and wrong, and that is sort of a confusion. I mean, I don't think any apologist or religious moral philosopher would agree with that. They would probably condemn people who say that as mistaken. They would say, look, if nothing else, you have a conscience, right? You have an inner sense, an inner compass of right that tells you right from wrong. So no, you shouldn't think that the wheels are going to come off. But you might say, okay, well, what if there was no conscience? What if God didn't put that there? Well, then they would still probably say, well, look, you'd still have rational self-interest that would keep you from doing a lot of bad stuff, right? It's just that nothing would actually be bad stuff. So it's not a question of moral epistemology, of how do you know what's right and wrong. It's what makes something right or wrong. What is a good-making property? What is a wrong-making property? Well, the critical ingredient is that there's a moral law, and God hands this down.
Well, I'm going to throw a little monkey wrench in the discussion here, and if we're going to talk about God handing down law, I kind of want to bring up the fact that I want to bring Genesis into the picture, because if Adam and Eve, if the tree of knowledge determined right from wrong, and if Adam and Eve didn't know right from wrong before they ate from the tree of knowledge, how did they know that it was wrong to eat from the tree of knowledge before they ate from it? Right? So if God laid down the law of morality from the tree of knowledge, how was it wrong to eat from the tree of knowledge if the tree of knowledge was the bearer of morality? Is my question making sense?
Yeah, I've always asked that same question myself.
I think that's one of the reasons why even though it clearly isn't, a lot of the Bible reads like the first draft of something, because that is like a very obvious question of if their knowledge of right and wrong and good and evil comes from eating this fruit. I guess the answer is that God commanded them to, and before they ate the fruit, before they gained the moral awareness, that they were just supposed to do what God told them to do, and they disobeyed orders. But then that brings up a whole...
But how could they be punished? How could they be punished for doing something wrong if they didn't know from wrong?
Well, and not only that, but as Ozzy has described very well here tonight, that very moral awareness that, if you follow the Genesis story, we seem to have gained from eating that fruit, that knowledge of right and wrong, is one of the things that modern apologists, when they make the moral argument, appeal to when making that argument. That knowledge of that moral awareness is part of the mark that we are made in the image of God. But apparently that wasn't part of our original programming, which is a little weird.
Yeah, I agree. That argument, that whole thing is incoherent. I mean, I have a different take on it, but go ahead, Chris. I'm interested to hear what you have to say.
Oh, no. That I'm presenting that as like I'm baffled. So I'm curious to hear what you have to say, Ozzy.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't actually think, and this is going to be sort of seem far out, because most people do think of the tree of, well, for those who don't know, there's the Garden of Eden story. There's a tree of life, and there's a tree of knowledge of good and evil. It's described in English as the tree of knowledge and good and evil. Now, I don't know what it says in the original languages, and you know, there's all kinds of problems on what it would have said in the original. But I mean, the expression tree of knowledge of good and evil might not mean a tree that confers specifically moral knowledge. It might just be a tree of knowledge in general. And so the argument, it goes like this. The expression tree of knowledge of good and evil is what's called a merism, possibly. A merism is a kind of figure of speech where, and it's not uncommon in the Old Testament, I understand, where something is referred to by a conventional phrase that enumerates several of things parts as a way of referring to the whole. For instance, if I say so-and-so bought it lock, stock, and barrel, okay, what we mean to say there is that he bought the whole gun, lock, stock, and barrel, right? Or even more figuratively, whatever the heck he was buying, he bought it lock, stock, and barrel. So when you say he bought it lock, stock, and barrel, you're not saying he bought, you know, separate parts. You're saying he bought the whole thing. Another example of a merism would be all creatures great and small. All right, the words great and small in that expression don't add anything extra to the concept of all creatures, right? And it doesn't restrict or limit the range of creatures that you're referring to. It's just a way of re-emphasizing the all when you say all creatures. So when you say all creatures great and small, you're just saying all creatures. So the argument goes like this. The expression the tree of knowledge is a merism. It really means the tree of knowledge. All knowledge, good and evil. In other words, it's just a tree that imparts knowledge, not specifically moral knowledge. And this would make sense since the Adam and Eve characters don't seem to lack the concept of morality prior to eating the tree, right? They have an inkling, oh, I better not do this. We were told not to do this. You know, Eve has her little conversation with the serpent, and Adam has his little conversation with Eve before he eats the forbidden fruit. So they do seem to have a sense of right and wrong beforehand, and there's no indication that their sense of right and wrong is improved after they eat it. I mean, I don't see that in the text. So I think maybe that might be a merism in the text. Now, I don't know, not reading the original language, that this is the case, but that to me I think is sort of the best way to interpret that story. I don't think it's a magic tree that confers knowledge. I think it's a moral knowledge. I think it's a magic tree that confers knowledge, and that's why the God character is so upset when they eat of it, because what he says when they eat of it is, you know, lo, behold, the man and the woman have become as one of us, right? Knowing good and evil. No, like that is knowing everything. He's become like one of us. He's talking to the host of heaven, where is a sort of a Zeus-like god with other gods and other supernatural beings in the host of heaven, and he's worried about usurpation. And he says, and now, lest they reach forth with their hand.
Who's the us? Who's the us? Because I thought the us was the Trinity.
Yeah, well, no, that's sort of a literal reading of it. I mean, we have to understand that these texts would have been written at a time when there would have been primarily polytheistic gods. This might have been a tale incorporated in the Bible from a polytheistic age. Certainly at this stage in the compilation of the Bible, people were monolatrous. They worshipped God above other gods, but he wasn't the only God. Yeah, well, read the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Not I'm the only God. There are no other gods to worship, right? It's thou shalt have no other gods before me. So I think what's happening here is God is upset, and he's worried that he's going to be usurped, and he says, you know, look out, the man and the woman have become as one of us, knowing good and evil, that is, knowing everything, having close to omniscience, they become godlike. And now, lest they reach forth with their hand and eat of the tree of life. Oh no, what's the only thing separating them from us now is immortality. Get them out of the garden. And so he gets them out of the garden, and the cherubs with flaming swords that keep Adam and Eve from getting back in, because they're this close to becoming godlike. There's lots of stories in the ancient world like this about sort of usurpation and stuff like that. The gods, Zeus is always afraid of being usurped, and his father, the Titan, is worried about being usurped. And this is sort of a trope in the ancient world. But that's a long story short. But or rather, it's a short story made long. So I think it's a merism that's going on there. It's just my intuition here. I didn't come up with this. I came across this a long time ago. But I think that would make sense of the story, because there's no indication that they have less moral knowledge before they eat of the fruit than after. So that would clear it up for me.
Well, I think that's a very nuanced treatment of that particular part of Genesis, because I've always wondered about that. I mean, I think Joey Livingston is the first person to bring that to my attention, and as soon as he did, it was one of the most obvious things that I never thought about, and I was just like, oh yeah, tree of knowledge, right and wrong. How would they know it's wrong to eat from it before they knew it was wrong? Mind blown. You know, it was just like, it was one of those perfectly obvious things that I just, having been raised Catholic, I just accepted it and never questioned it. And it was just like one of those beautiful things where it was just like, think about it, Chris. And I was like, oh, okay, upon thinking about it, it's a little silly the way, you know, if I were to take it upon the face value that I was taking it upon. But, you know, taking it with a little more nuance, like you were saying, it certainly is, it makes a little bit more sense. So, redirecting. Steve, were there more nuanced arguments that C.S. Lewis tries to put forth about his morality claims?
Well, Lewis's arguments themselves aren't at least I didn't find them terribly nuanced or terribly different from other arguments dealing with morality that I've encountered before. But the thing about Lewis is that he presents it all so eloquently, and he's really, really good in Mere Christianity. His really great talent in the book is coming up with metaphors and painting scenarios to illustrate his ideas and his concepts. He's so great at that. And like even just the
Can you give an example?
Two people. Well, I was just even the example of the two people having an argument. And I mean, we've all heard this version of the moral argument before, this tactic of making the argument where they say, well, suppose we have, you know, a culture over here and a culture over here, and each culture has its own separate moral standards, and they disagree on whether a particular act is moral or immoral. So who decides who's right? And lots of apologists have made that argument, that there must be a moral standard because there has to be the ultimate arbiter to settle these disputes. How do you decide who is really right and who is really wrong? And Lewis takes that and reduces it to the level of two people having a quarrel. And it's much more relatable. And not only does he communicate the same concept of it's not just a matter of personal taste, you know, you're making an argument that something is truly right or truly wrong. It also establishes that these two warring factions are implicitly agreeing that a higher standard exists. Even if they don't agree with what the standard says, they're arguing that they're right. Not just that they think they're right, but that they are right. So even though they disagree with what the standard actually says, they are agreeing that the standard exists and that they are appealing to it. And that's the only example that pops into mind right away. But throughout Mere Christianity, he's very good at painting little pictures and putting across his ideas. It's really what makes that book tolerable to read, because the actual ideas I didn't find very persuasive, but the writing itself and the presentation was light years beyond most what you would read from an apologetics book, especially a modern apologetics book.
So, Steve, what is the argument against there being a objective morality or an objective standard that determines what two people are arguing about, what makes it right? You know, who is the arbiter? What is the arbiter? What determines the correctness between two people's argument if it's not an objective standard?
Well, there are a couple of ways to look at it. One way is to view morality from at different scales. If you look at morality from the scale of an individual, from my perspective, I can say, in a sense, morality is objective because I don't make up my own morals. I accept a pre-existing standard. I've come to accept that certain things are right and certain things are wrong, and those concepts were not originated by me; they originated beyond me. So, from my perspective, they're objective. But I would argue, from the perspective of humanity as a whole, they're not objective, or at least they're not objective in the sense that they come from outside of us. They're generated by us. They're generated by our moral consensus. So in that sense, objective standards do exist, but you can still have disagreement over those. And the way I get around that, or the way I feel about that, is I don't see any reason why there has to be an objective moral arbiter. Maybe there is no such thing as someone is just right and someone is just wrong. When William Lane Craig makes this argument, he really hits this point very hard. And you know, he actually says at one point in his typical spiel, if there were no God, then absolute morals wouldn't exist, but absolute morals do exist. And that's usually all the further he takes it. He doesn't try to demonstrate why we should believe that moral absolutes do exist. He just says, but we all know that they do. And then he'll cite some very emotionally charged example, like, you know, murdering babies is wrong. Everybody agrees with that. That's a moral absolute, right?
But eating them is delicious.
From my perspective, yeah, exactly. He should, you know, that's
brown butter sauce.
That's religious bigotry, I think, on his part, because you know it's part of our atheist culture, and we think it's fine. But the idea that that just because we think there ought to be an absolute moral standard, just because we think we would be more comforted by there being a true, absolute, universal, transcendent right, doesn't mean that there has to be one, and doesn't mean that there is one. And I'm kind of okay with that. If that's the true nature of reality, if that's the way things are, I accept that. I don't insist that they're, well, yeah, but how do you decide who's really right and who's really wrong? What if, well, maybe you can't. Maybe it's just a disagreement that the parties have to resolve on their own. You know?
Exactly.
So, yeah.
I think I'm going to do the unthinkable here. I think I'm going to defend William Lane Craig a little bit.
Do it.
Okay, this is.
You could probably do it better than he could do it himself.
Yeah, I might throw up a little bit while I do it, but
don't keep it in your own mouth.
Okay, boys, this has never happened. I'm about to agree with William Lane Craig on something. No, I don't. I actually agree with what Steve. I agree with what Steve has said here. That the argument is hokum. William Lane Craig's argument is if there is a moral order, that necessitates a God. There has to be a God if there's a moral order. So a moral order implies God. There is a moral order, therefore God. Well, that's technically a valid argument. That is, the conclusion follows from the premises. If the premises are right, the conclusion is right. That's perfectly undisputable. The problem is that the premises. The first premise, the what's called the hypothetical conditional premise, the if-then part, if there is morality, then God exists. That, I think, is extremely dubious, and he needs to defend that, and he doesn't do that very well. I mean, he offers some arguments, but they're not very good. But then the other premise is there is an absolute morality. Well, that too can be challenged. But in his defense, this is what I'm going to say in his defense, when he's making the argument, he's always given some defense of the first premise. If there is morality, then there is a God. He always does do that. What he doesn't do is then defend the premise that there is an absolute morality or moral order. He just assumes that. But what he's doing there is he's asking the other person, you would agree with that, right? You would agree that there is a moral order, right? You do in fact think that it is objectively wrong to rape infants, right? For your own sexual gratification. That is wrong, right? You would agree, right? Right? And that's why he chooses these outrageous examples that he knows everyone's going to agree with that, right? And so he thinks, okay, well, if I've got them to say this, agree with this, and I've given an argument for the first part, and if people agree with the first part, well, then the argument holds. So if I can get people to agree with both premises, then I've proven that God exists. And so what he's trying to do there is we do this in argument all the time. You list some premises, and what you try to do is then get the person to acknowledge that the premises that you have presented are true. And he does that with that second premise where he says you would agree that this is objectively wrong, right? And most people would say, yeah. Now, some people would say, no, I don't think it's objectively wrong. A lot of people would try to say that, but that's actually kind of hard to do because you sort of feel very uncomfortable saying, yeah, there are times when I think it's okay to, sexually molest infants for my own sexual pleasure. You can imagine a nightmare scenario where aliens visit Earth and they're going to just eradicate and vaporize all life on the planet unless you do this heinous act. You can imagine circumstances so horrible where you'd think, okay, well, it's going to be excusable, as horrible as it is, excusable in this instance. It might be the right thing to do, even the morally necessary thing to do. But you can tweak the example where he says, no, would it be morally right to do it just for your own sexual gratification, right? Well, no, under those circumstances, no, that would never be right. Would it? Well, no, I guess not. And then he goes, okay, well, there you go. Now you've now hit on a rock bottom moral principle that he thinks everyone would agree to, and that everyone is uncomfortable denying. So he thinks he's got you there, and now he just has to make sure that his arguments for the first part, if there is an absolute moral order, then there's a God. If that first premise holds, and he's got you on the second one, then he's got you to the conclusion there has to be a God.
Nope.
Silence.
That crafty
Nope.
Craig.
I'm not buying that for $1.
The thing.
Well, I don't buy the first premise at all. I'll give him the second one. I won't give him the first one.
Well,
the thing is about the moral standards that we all appeal to is my usual response when I hear that argument, like Craig makes it, is I'm perfectly willing. Yeah, I would agree. It's wrong to rape infants. You know, I don't have to disagree with that premise in order to disagree with the premise that absolute morality must exist and it must be evidence of God. To me, I would say, yeah, okay, raping infants for sexual gratification is wrong. And the reason it's wrong is because we, and I'm using we in the broadest sense, decided that it was wrong. We chose to declare this to be an unacceptable act, just as we chose to declare other murder and rape and theft and all these other things. We made these decisions, not as individuals, but as cultures, as civilizations, throughout many, many, many generations. We decided these things. We sort of made these rules. And the way I look at it, my personal philosophy on it is, if we didn't, then what do the rules possibly mean? If we didn't decide for ourselves, out of our own conscience, out of our own empathy, out of our own regard for the greater good and for our communities and for our well-being and respect for each other's rights, etc., if we didn't create these moral principles, what possible good can they be? If we're just following a set of rules that someone from outer space imposed on us, then we're not really moral beings. You know, we're just people that know how to follow rules.
But how is it different if I'm just following the social rules? Like, let's say, I mean, I think it's true. We do come up with these rules. But let me sort of express it how I see it from my perspective. From my perspective, we don't just come up with these rules. I think making it sound like we just agreed on this sounds like a committee got together and decided, okay, I think this is the best policy. I don't think that's how it really happens. But yes, we do agree on these things, and they do come out of us. But to make it sound like we just sort of agreed on this makes it sound like it's just a mere convention. It's just like we decided, you know, here in North America when we drive on the right, we pass on the left. Everyone's got to stick to the right except when they're going to pass. And red means stop and green means go. We could have decided otherwise, right? I don't think we want our sense of morality of right and wrong, especially about serious things, to ever be a matter of just convention and say that, oh, it's just we just agreed to it this way, because we, you know. No. What is implied by that is if we just all agreed, if I could just persuade everyone that you know we should be eating our children or something like that, you know, then by definition, you know, well, if we should, they are tasty. So I'm told. I'm not going to admit to anything here. We're live. We're on air. I'm not going to admit to it. If an implication of saying that morality comes from our agreement is that if we were to agree otherwise, then the moral order would be otherwise. And so it is literally a deductive consequence of that view that if we were to decide, if we were all just to get together and agree that, you know, eating female children is fine, you know, then that would literally be fine. That would be moral. And I don't know, that doesn't sit well with my moral intuitions. I think that we want morality to be made of sterner stuff than that. I don't think that's right. I don't think that's how morality.
No, I think we're totally ignoring the elephant in the room, which is developmental psychology, which is that there is a very solid theory of moral development, and the kind of morals that everybody's talking about right now is the kind of morals that we all develop out of in childhood. Like the goal of morality is a morality that comes from within, not one that we abide to from without. You know what I mean? That kind of morality is the kind of morality that we abide to, like when we're young, like, you know, to avoid punishment or to attain reward. That's the kind of morality that like 5-year-olds have or 7-year-olds have. You know what I mean? Yeah. That's not adult morality. Adult morality is empathic and compassionate behavior, knowing right from wrong based on being able to place yourself in another person's shoes and wanting to do something based on maybe, I don't know, reciprocity, golden rule, something like
Right.
that.
Well, and yeah, I mean, it is much deeper than I made it sound when I said that we decided. We decided in a sense that it's not just a cultural thing, although there are cultural components. There are biological components. There seems to be an evolutionary element to moral standards, to the fact that we have a conscience, to the fact that we show empathy for each other. We're social animals. That's probably the basis. And it's Richard Dawkins has written about it might be an extension of kin selection or kin preference. But the point is that it's our morality, and yeah, we didn't sit down at a table and decide, okay, all those in favor of making murder a taboo say aye, and it was 51 to 49, so murder's out. Ozzy's right. It's a lot deeper than that. It's a lot more fundamental to our being than that. But the point is that it's ours, and it comes from us. It comes from our nature. It comes from our evolution. It comes from our civilizations, our cultures. And it's much deeper than just a matter of preference or a matter of just a very bare consensus. It's much more deeply rooted than that. But it's rooted in ourselves and in our histories and in our biologies and in our cultures and in our minds and our characters. And if it's not, if it's just sort of, if it's someone else's, if it's God's morality that we're just sort of called to follow, that seems very hollow to me, and I don't understand how that is preferable to a morality that is generated from within us.
I think you're right when you say that morality that it comes from us, but I don't think that that's necessarily incompatible with morality being objective. And when I say objective, I don't mean coming from God. I just mean objective. Like when you take something like how we feel about homosexuality, and that's something that throughout history society has deemed as, well, almost always deemed as wrong. Not always, but almost always deemed as wrong. But I think that it doesn't really matter what point in history you look at, whether or not it's right or wrong. It would have been right or wrong to revile and abuse and treat with inequality homosexuals. Probably, I mean, for me, it would have always been wrong. And it does come out of our nature. It does come out of how we want to treat people and how we want to be treated ourselves. But I think there is sort of an objective. It is objective that we should treat them in a certain way as opposed to another way, and I feel that's probably true of all moral questions. So it doesn't have anything to do with consensus at all. And we may always be wrong on a moral issue. We may throughout history make the wrong decision. It might always be better to do something that we don't do or don't know about. And that's just how I feel about it. I think that yeah.
Yeah, this touches on it doesn't touch on. It's exactly the point that I was going to get to about things that come out of our nature. There are things that come out of our nature that are very good: altruism, mutualism, reciprocity, care for the kin, for young people and stuff like that. I mean, we have all kinds of benign impulses, and there's all kinds of research that shows that even very, very small children that don't even speak yet experience empathy and have a very rudimentary level of empathy compared to what they will grow into. But are sort of have benign impulses to help and assist and stuff like that. There's some very charming experiments that were done on this, where they get little kids that are actually working to help open the door to facilitate someone when they see that they're struggling to move something through a doorway and stuff like that. The kids just volunteer this assistance, right? This is sort of cute helpful chimp behavior, you know. But there's a dark side of our human nature, and if you want to anchor morality into human nature, you're going to have a problem. You're going to have the problem, for instance, of jealousy. That's human too. Xenophobia, tribalism, prejudice, that's very human too. So if you want to sort of, we verge on the is-ought fallacy here, you know, where you look at somebody or some species and you say this is how they do things, and if what's good is what's natural and what's natural is good, then you're going to have a problem. It turns out that all kinds of horrible social evils and simple interpersonal evils bubble right out of human nature. You know, we're hairless apes pretty much, and there's a really dark side to our nature. And so I wouldn't want to ground morality just in that, right? There's got to be, I think, much more to the story. And as Ilana was saying, at any particular stage in our history, you're going to be able to look back at that stage and go, wow, you know, they really were getting stuff wrong. You know, like something like slavery is obviously one of the worst things we ever civilizationally got entangled with, right? It just has immiserated so many millions of people all over the world in history, and you know, we seem to have thrown that off finally, but not entirely, not exclusively, you know. But then there are other social evils as I see them, you know, prejudice against women, discrimination against homosexuals and stuff like that. These, I think, are social evils that we need to sort of rid ourselves of. But you know, at any given stage, there are going to be things that we're doing that where future generations will look back at us and think that we were rather quaint. If they're charitable, and if they're not charitable, they'll just condemn us outright as horrible people, just as we do when we look back in our history. I wouldn't want to anchor morality strictly in human impulses, because so many of our human impulses are just vicious and horrible and cruel. You know.
I kind of want to ride on the coattails of what you're saying, Ozzy, and admit that there's something called the naturalistic fallacy, right? All things that are natural aren't necessarily good. Earthquakes are natural. Venom is natural. You know what I mean? And just because they're natural doesn't necessarily mean that they're good for us. But at the same time, we have to frame all the things that are both bad and good as perceptions of things that are really just neutral, right? And so that's coming from somebody that works in the experimental psychology world, right? So I study, so to root things in my field, and then I will relate them to morality in a second. I study the psychology of the sense of smell. Odors in general are neutral, right? Fragrances, odorants are neutral, but we are more sensitive to negative odors than we are to positive odors, and that's just because negative odors are a more salient signal to us than positive odors are. We want to be much more protective of ourselves of things that are negative than we want to be aware of things that we can approach, right? Because things that are dangerous to us we just need to be more vigilant of than things that we are going to be aware of searching for in the environment. That's just the way that we are evolutionarily. So with that in mind, relating that to the examples that you gave, Ozzy, we might have these biases, which is in-group biases, which is prejudices against, and based on those in-group biases, because my in-group is men having prejudices against women, because my in-group is heterosexuality having biases against homosexuality. You know what I mean? Things like that. They exist without a doubt, and we can't deny them. But they exist for a reason, and that might be evolutionarily, and it might take us a longer time to shed those negative aspects of our personality, those cognitive biases and these heuristics that make us human. But that's just because they served a purpose evolutionarily. And I'm not saying that excuses them in any way, shape, or form, but I think that there is value in framing them as things are neutral, until we apply a negative or positive bias to them. So in saying that things are morally right or wrong, I think that there's value in saying, yes, we have a tendency as humans to have these negative proponents, but if we're going to root morality in human nature, we have to admit that we have positive tendencies that we can work upon, even though we also have negative instincts that are reflexive, because we do have inhibitory and excitatory connections between our amygdala and our prefrontal cortex. So our emotions and our executive decision making is a two-way pathway. So these reflexes that we have and these positive attributes that we have control. We have control over inhibiting the negative and enhancing the positive. And I guess that's really the point that I'm making, and I took a really long-winded way of making that point. And if we're going to root morality in human nature, we can admit that there is negative, and that negative might be instinctually and evolutionarily based, but we also should emphasize the fact that there is positive and use the positive as a springboard upon which we can build more positives. And I guess that's really my point, and I just took a hell of a long way to say it. Sorry, guys. Any thoughts on that?
I was thinking back when Ilana was talking about our evolving attitudes about the treatment of homosexuals, for example, or when Ozzy said about the ridding our culture of slavery after having slavery for so many generations. The idea that moral concepts change over time, that they evolve, that this is something that happens continuously, there's nothing you can do about it, it just seems to be a natural part of human existence. We get together and our ideas change over time. There's that, and there's also the fact that not every moral question is very easily settled. Mere Christianity, to a large extent, and really most Christian apologists who use the moral argument, present morality in black and white terms, as though, well, there are things that are right and there are things that are wrong, and we all know what's right and we all know what's wrong, and that must indicate something. But there are lots and lots of moral questions that we deal with both in our individual lives, that we have to grapple with, decisions we have to make that we're not sure what the right thing to do is, and issues that we deal with as communities and as civilizations, that we have to figure out what should we do. What rights should we confer on a particular group? How should we treat a particular group of people? Should we go to war with this other country or not? These issues aren't always black and white, and morality is often a very, very messy, uncertain field, where just because you have a concept of right and wrong doesn't mean that you know what you should do and what you should not do. And that is another thing to me that suggests that it has a natural basis, that it doesn't come to us from on high, from a perfect arbiter of right and wrong, that we don't always know what we're supposed to do. We don't always know what the right thing to do is. Even though we might have some abstract idea, well, there is a right thing to do, we just don't know what it is. And I suppose a Christian would respond to this by saying, well, it's just that we lack an awareness of the moral law. God is telling us what we're supposed to do, but we just can't quite hear him. But that doesn't really cut ice with me. I think it's more indicative of, like, as when we find imperfection in other parts of nature. When we look at the way our bodies are designed, and an intelligent design advocate might say, look how splendid the human cell is, and look how it tells us of the design of God. And a biologist would say, yeah, but look at this and this and this, and this is redundant, and this doesn't need to be there, and this is, I don't know where the hell this came from. And it's not actually as perfectly designed as it looked to be at first. I think you can say something similar about our concepts of morality.
Well, I'm curious to hear what people think of C.S. Lewis's book Mere Christianity in the lexicon and landscape of other apologetic books, because I haven't read a ton of books on Christian apologetics, but I did read Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and I know that in the same sense that C.S. Lewis is his arguments are pervasive in current apologetics, whether or not people who are using the apologetics realize that C.S. Lewis popularized them. People also use, evidence that demands a verdict, Josh McDowell's arguments, whether they realize that they originated or were popularized by Josh McDowell. And the reason why I even read Josh McDowell is because one of my best friends at the time when I was in my early 20s became a born-again Christian and mailed me Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And he's like, you need to read this because I'm concerned about your soul because you're going to go to hell. And so I read it, and even though I wasn't savvy about any of the apologetics or philosophy or anything that I'm familiar with now, I'm 42 now, I just knew something wasn't right about what I was reading. It's like the arguments didn't make sense, but I just couldn't tether the inconsistencies to anything that made sense philosophically, where now I could probably articulate it better, but I haven't read it since I was 20. But I'm just curious, has anybody else read books on apologetics, and how do they fare against the arguments that C.S. Lewis is making in Mere Christianity? Obviously, Steve has read many books on apologetics, so you kind of,
I've read a few.
Yeah. Considering you have a series called An Atheist Reads.
Yeah.
Take it away, Steve.
It's my masochistic side. Well, we were talking a little bit before we went on the air, actually. I think, Ozzy, you said you had read The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, and that was the first one that I read for the series that I do. And I had actually read that years before. My then girlfriend, now ex-girlfriend, at the time was a very devout Christian, and she gave me The Case for Christ and was like, just read this, And I said, okay, and I read it, and it didn't really make an impression on me. And then many, many years later, I read it again for the series. And one of the things that struck me about it, and really about all of the apologetics books that I've read other than Mere Christianity so far, is how very, very poorly written it was. My education, my training, I guess, is as a writer, and I'm an English student, so that's sort of where I'm naturally inclined to look at things, and that's sort of the lens that I always sort of view things through. And reading Lee Strobel's Case for Christ was brutal, because it's just so horribly written. And Strobel is a professional writer. I mean, he's not just a guy who just picked up a pen one day and said, I'm going to write a apologetic. I mean, he was a reporter. He's a journalist, so he has some training as a writer too. And it's really shocking how badly written it is. Some of that is just from some choices that he obviously made very early on in the project. The book is structured in an interview series. Every chapter is him talking to a different expert about a different aspect of Christianity or the life of Christ or whatever. And he writes these interviews like he's writing scenes from like an action novel. It's like dialogue and attributives and, describing how the guy would, I asked my question and he leaned back thoughtfully in his chair. Just a lot of bullshit that doesn't lend itself to being taken seriously. And it really sticks out, especially if you read Mere Christianity. And for all of the things about it that I don't like, it is at least a very elegantly written, charmingly written book that you can sit down and read, and it's like having a conversation with an intelligent, charming friend who you disagree with, but you enjoy talking to them. That's like C.S. Lewis, but Lee Strobel and Josh McDowell, not so much.
Well, Josh McDowell came across as propaganda to me, like straight up propaganda, like. There was something about the way that he was presenting his argument that just like it might as well have been written in bold-face font with exclamation points after every sentence.
Yeah. Well, and McDowell is very self-aggrandizing too, which Strobel is a little bit here and there just to establish his credibility. Like he talks himself up as a journalist a little bit. But in Evidence That Demands a Verdict, which was the most recent book that I did for my series, so it's still kind of fresh in my mind, Josh McDowell is just relentlessly self-aggrandizing. never misses a chance to talk about an argument that he won with a college professor, or to talk about some important plan that he had. My favorite part is an early part of Evidence That Demands a Verdict, where Josh McDowell is describing how before he got saved and dedicated his life to the Lord, he had come up with like a 15-year plan as a college student that eventually he was going to become the governor of Michigan. But then he became a Christian and he gave that up. And he talks about it as though this was actually going to happen. You know, like it wasn't just some weird fancy of his. Like no. This was history. He was going to become the governor of Michigan. He was going to use people and take advantage of people and claw his way to the top. And he gave all that up for the life of a Christian and for the work of the Lord. It's just ridiculous.
I remember reading it, and I just had a hard time explaining to my friend why I didn't find the arguments convincing, because he did. And so it was like one of those weird things where it's just like two people looking at the same piece of evidence, and one of them being like, that proves it, doesn't it? And the other person being like, yeah, not so much, but I can't shake loose why I don't believe it, but I don't. So it was like one of those standstills. Ozzy, what about you?
Well, I've also read Evidence That Demands a Verdict, but I read that quite a long time ago, and I read it in sort of sandwiched in with a whole bunch of other books, and frankly it blends in with some others that I was reading at the time. But yeah, needless to say, it doesn't live up to C.S. Lewis. One of the nice things about C.S. Lewis is he was a very, very intelligent man, and he wasn't just a propagandist. He was a stylist. He knew how to write, and he had a bigger picture. You know, he wasn't just trying to, he wasn't just trying to convert people. He was trying to educate his fellow Christians. He wasn't just sort of trying to, win souls or anything like that. I mean, when I read his stuff, I always feel like I'm learning something about Christianity. I feel like I'm getting a sober, reflective man's a serious Christian. I mean, I happen to think that Christianity is a serious religion. It imposes serious moral demands on people, or at least it can. And I mean, not everyone takes it seriously, but the sort of within mainstream Christianity, the sort of the moral normative example of Jesus would be a hard one to follow and live up to, right? Turn the other cheek and all that, and these are hard things to live up to. So. He seems to me like someone who took his religion very, very seriously, thought about it a lot, and tried to think through all the hard problems, like the problem of hell. He's got a book called The Great Divorce and stuff like that that deals with hell and stuff like that. And you get the sense that he is trying to articulate the hard concepts within Christianity, the hard theological concepts, and impart them to a mainstream readership, so that you don't have to be a theologian. So, I mean, I think he is the guy to read if you want to understand sort of mainstream Christianity and what it says, and understand some of its theology without, having to know a bunch of Latin and stuff like that. And I thought he was great. Whereas people like Lee Strobel, who wrote The Case for Christ, I mean, that was just a sickening book. I thought it was so bad. It was so full of terrible arguments, historically bad arguments, picking and choosing facts, ignoring obvious rejoinders and objections, or hand waving them away. It was just cherry picking all the way through. Actually, if I may plug a couple of books that I read that were excellent.
Please do.
And they're kind of debunking books. And if you've read Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ and you find it very persuasive, there's a couple of books I can recommend that I think will make you very seriously reconsider the reliability of Lee Strobel on these matters. One is by Robert M. Price, called The Case Against the Case for Christ. Now, Robert M. Price is a mythicist. He's someone who seriously doubts the existence of Jesus, thinks he probably didn't exist at all. But you don't have to sort of agree with him on any of that. None of that comes into the book. The Case Against the Case for Christ is just sort of a sober, New Testament scholar historical evaluation of Lee Strobel's historical evidence and arguments for the picture that he paints of the life of Jesus and the evidence for trusting the Gospels. And then another one is by another fellow, also a mythicist, named Earl Doherty. He's just an amateur. He's not a sort of a scholar. He doesn't work in academia or anything like that. But he wrote a book called Challenging. No, not Challenging the Verdict. He wrote a book called Challenging the Verdict. That's what it was called. And it's another debunking of Lee Strobel's book. They're both excellent. They both almost say the same things, because almost anybody in the field would be able to sort of tell you these things. And I'm sort of lucky that I stumbled on those books, because when I first read The Case for Christ, I didn't know what to make of it. I thought, well, geez, this seems kind of plausible, but I knew just enough about sort of historical method, historiography, to know that this was fishy. And then I started looking up these other books that were critical of them, like, are there any criticism of this? And then I found those, and they were very, very good. And I don't agree with Earl Doherty and Robert M. Price on their views, but certainly their assessment of the evidence in that book, excellent.
And Ilana, have you had any experience reading these apologetic books?
No, I can't say I have. I'm not a good atheist. I don't read all these books at all.
How dare you not read the
know.
opposition?
Sorry. Interesting to hear about it, though.
I know it seems to be like a little cottage industry, right? Like I wonder how much I wonder how much sales the apologists make from atheists reading their books, right? Because,
oh yeah.
Just for fun, it's like riding a roller coaster, right? It's like something you purposely do as a masochistic way of raising your blood pressure.
And you have to understand, I really don't have to read these books because I have Ozzy, right? All day long, every day.
That's a great point. That's a great point. But
it's all we talk about.
there is value in reading what the other side thinks, but the problem I've encountered reading the apologetics books I've read is you get a lot of disingenuousness in terms of what the aim is, because with the exception of Mere Christianity, the other books I've read have all included some element in their either in their introduction or one of the early chapters where they claim to be pitched at least partially at non-believers. Like Lee Strobel says, if you haven't accepted Christ, I'm just showing you the evidence. I'm just going to make the case, and you can decide for yourself. They play at objectivity, and there's very little objectivity. I mean, most modern apologetics is pitched at the church, is pitched at the people who already believe. It's not pitched at people who are challenging the faith, who might ask for an apologetic or ask for an explanation. It's pitched at people who already believe this stuff and are just asking for some reassurance or some things to say to their non-religious relatives or what have you. And one of the nice things about C.S. Lewis's book is that it doesn't really have much of that. It feels like you know where you stand with him right from the beginning. A lot of Mere Christianity is actually sort of rewritten from radio addresses that Lewis gave on the BBC in the 1940s. So there's a conversational tone to it. There's an openness about it, and you don't feel like you're being hoodwinked, and you don't feel like he's saying, "Oh, this is for you," but then you realize it's not actually for you. Whereas a lot of the, like Strobel, McDowell, Norman Geisler, and Frank Turek, who wrote another book that I reviewed called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, they play at addressing atheists with their arguments, but really they're not. It's a complete con.
Steve, have you thought about reading Tim LaHaye's Mind Siege? Have you heard of it?
No, I don't think I actually have heard of it. I'll add it to my list. I have a big list of books to possibly read for future.
If you want to get
to the list,
if you want to get really upset, if you want to genuinely get really, really upset, I suggest you read, and I think it's Tim LaHaye, right? The Left Behind series author.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he wrote a book or co-authored a book called Mind Siege, where he just blatantly lays out how bad things are because of atheism and secularism, and it's fantastic. It's just the book for you to be covering from an atheist's perspective.
Is that
So,
nonfiction or is it fiction like Left Behind?
I guess from my perspective, it's fiction. From his perspective, I think he wants it to be nonfiction.
Okay.
Okay, but it's not a story, right? It's supposed to be nonfiction.
It's supposed to be nonfiction. It is how secular society is leading towards the apocalypse.
I actually read the entire Left Behind series. I couldn't get enough of it.
Okay, good. So good. So you have a little bit of the masochist in you. And
Yeah.
I appreciate
well, for the fiction side, maybe.
Good. I appreciate that. All right.
I read the first. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say I read the first of the Left Behind series, and it was a howler, and I passed it off to Ilana, and then she got hooked. She had to read all of them. She just couldn't. She just had to know where this story was going, and she just couldn't get off. And but I had enough after the first. Maybe I read the second one too. I don't know. I think I certainly read the first one.
It was hysterical. I couldn't get enough of it.
Yeah. There's some other.
I get the feeling that the Left Behind series is like mental floss for you, Ozzy.
I don't know. It felt almost pornographic. It was, but it was a little tough to get through. When I wasn't laughing, I found it a little sickening. Sort of the celebration that was going on in that book. Of sort of misery and horror. You get the sense that people who read this book are cheering, are praying fervently for this sacred genocide to happen.
Oh yeah, and they make Jesus Christ look like a superhero. It's the superheroes, Jesus Christ, coming to save us.
Yeah, well, I didn't get that far. I didn't get that far in the series. That doesn't happen in the first book. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But there were some other apologetic books I read, and I disagreed with Steve on something actually. With respect to the Josh McDowell book and the Lee Strobel book, I think those really are intended for non-believers. I think that they think that they can bamboozle people on the history and the evidence for Jesus and the historicity of the reliability of the Gospels and stuff like that. I think they really are doing that, and I could see those books working on someone who doesn't know about history and how it's written, and I can see a person sort of reading this and going, oh really, and then sort of looking into the Gospels and thinking, oh yeah, okay, well I've been reassured that this is all on the level. I could see that happening. But there are books like William Lane Craig's Reasonable Faith. That's a much more philosophical type of apologetical work. It's full of mostly philosophical arguments for the existence of God. All the standard ones that we've heard before, but that one is sort of pitched a little higher, and that one is definitely intended for believers. And there was another book, I think it's J.P. Moreland, Scaling the Secular City or something like that. I read that when it first came out. I've forgotten about it. Haven't thought much about it since, but that one was sort of in a similar vein. Those books, I think, are definitely all about shoring up a believer against any possible doubt that they might have. Just insulating them against any objection that might come, so that they sort of have an immunity to an objection when it comes to them. They just know, oh no, I've heard that. I see where you're coming. I know how to deflect that, and without sort of taking the objection on board. I think that a lot of those books do that. They're about putting on armor.
Well, I think so as well. I mean, but I do think that they are really meant. I do think that they're disingenuous. I have to agree with Steve on it. I mean, unless you are really, really naive about what reliable sources were and references and things like that, I can't see how anybody would approach a book like Evidence That Demands a Verdict or The Case for Christ or Lee Strobel or anything like that as a reliable source, as somebody who always looks at the references, who always looks at the footnotes, who always looks at the endnotes, as that guy. and seeing that they're perpetually like referring to the Bible to back up his case, that, you know, immediately that just like brings up questions like, oh, so this guy's whole argument is based on things from the Bible, not outside sources. So the validity of the Bible is based on the words in the Bible, and the Bible is true because God says so, and God exists because the Bible. Oh, hold on a second. This sounds all too familiar. Hold on a second. Why am I listening to this? So I do think that they're.
But that's not Lee Strobel's.
You know, if they're trying to purport. That might not be Lee Strobel, but it's. I haven't read Lee, but I have read Josh McDowell. And Josh McDowell, all of his footnotes are, not all of them, many of his footnotes and endnotes are from the Bible. You know, in order to prove his point, he references the Bible pretty much. You know, his points are made self-referentially from the Bible, and it makes it very difficult it makes it difficult as an atheist to sink your teeth into what he's saying, because if you're trying to make a point to an atheist about the Bible and you're self-referentially making if you're making references to the Bible about the points you're making about the Bible, it's just like you're already talking past me. You know what I mean? And that was one of the problems. That's one of the reasons why I found that book very propaganda-like.
Yeah, well, they're both definitely propaganda, and I think anyone who's sort of familiar with, you know, that kind of thing is going to sort of spot it a mile off. But a lot of people aren't. A lot of people have never read a book that purports to be about a historical character. You know, I mean, it's shameful to say, but you know, a lot of people, you know, most people, you know, probably haven't gone to university, and they don't look up footnotes, and they read a book, and if this is sort of one of those first books you pick up on this kind of subject. And it looks like, hey, it's, you know, it's all these scholars and historians and philosophers and this kind of thing. You're going to think, oh well, they must know what they're talking about. I mean, Lee Strobel's book, you know, is, you know, him going around and talking to various characters and apologists and stuff like that, and it's all laid out like, oh yeah, historians agree. You know, like William Lane Craig is always, you know, talking endlessly about, oh yeah, historians agree on this. Most historians agree. That's the flavor of Lee Strobel's book, for instance. You get that over and over again, and you know, unless your BS detectors are sort of, you know, fully on board, yeah, I can easily see someone succumbing to that.
You know, that's a good point.
Sorry, Steve, I cut you off there, I think.
Oh no, it's cut me off anytime you like. That's true.
What about now?
No, that was the one time you couldn't do it. I do think that if you are a non-religious person and you haven't really thought about these things, maybe just you're sort of a de facto atheist because it just doesn't interest you or it hasn't mattered to you. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, that's what I had in mind, actually.
Yeah, the arguments could be persuasive if you haven't really thought about it. But what makes me think that it's disingenuous, especially with Strobel, because he features very prominently in one of his early chapters, maybe even the introduction for Case for Christ, I think. He makes a big deal about the fact that he used to be an atheist himself.
Yeah, I didn't buy it.
Yeah, I didn't buy it either. I mean, I'm not really comfortable. I don't know. I don't know what was in his head. I can't say, oh, he wasn't an atheist. But what made my alarm bells go off was he described atheism in a way that I have only ever heard it described by non-atheists.
That's right.
Yeah, he didn't describe it from the inside. He talked about how he was an atheist because he didn't want to have to follow God's rules, or because he wanted to live his unethical lifestyle. And these are things that Christians, like evangelical Christians, trying to put atheism in a bad light, will say about atheists, that we're all just a bunch of hedonists, that we're amoral, and we bristle at the idea of divine authority, and that's why we call ourselves atheists. And I read that and I thought, you know, it's very difficult for me to believe that someone who actually was an atheist would describe his atheism like that, even if he no longer calls himself an atheist. Wouldn't you at least have the honesty to say, okay, you know, my arguments are strong enough the case for Christ is so strong that anybody could possibly see the evidence and would be led to believe in Christ. So I'm not going to mischaracterize atheism, and I'm not going to try to use my former atheism as some kind of a pedestal to stand on and say, see, look, I used to be an atheist and now I'm not. You know, and that's very early in the book. But that was one of the things that really jumped out at me. It made me think, okay, he says he's writing this partially to atheists, but I really don't think he is. He's preaching to the choir.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I agree. I absolutely agree with that. That I thought was very fishy. And I mean, it's impossible to judge with any real confidence that he's just lying about that. I mean, I can't say that. But I mean, it seems like you said, he seems to misdescribed it so badly, as I recall, that at the time when I read it, I went, I'm not buying this at all. But there is it occurs to me there just now, I'd never thought of this before, but it occurs to me now that if he's been a Christian for a long time and he's that flavor of Christian who thinks that if you're an atheist, the reason that you're an atheist is that you're denying God, you're bristling at the idea of being under the authority of God, and you just want to be, you're in love with your sin and you want to just go about your sinful ways, and this is why. If you think this way long enough, you might look back on your life and say, well, by definition, that must have been why I was an atheist. You know, so he even if he doesn't remember that that's why he was doing it, he might sort of think back that on himself as having been that way, even if it wasn't born of an actual recollection. I don't know.
But that kind of drive-by atheism is like, hey, one time I drove through Nashville and I have all sorts of opinions about the music scene now. You know what I mean? It's like, no, that's not how it works. You don't get to do that. You don't get to be a passive, misunderstood label of what you think I am and then impart those misunderstandings onto me. That's not how it works. You don't get to do that. Drive-by atheism doesn't work. You know, you don't get to do Stephen Colbert on me. You don't get to co-opt my idea and then make it look silly in an attempt to make your position look better. That doesn't work. It works for Stephen Colbert. It doesn't work for you. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It seems to me that it's entirely possible. In fact, I'm positive that there are lots of people who are not religious because they hate the implications of religion and the existence of a God and that kind of thing and the moral strictures that it would imply if there was a God. I think that there really are some people who are, just as there are religious people who are religious in bad faith and who in their heart of hearts can't really bring themselves to believe it but feel that it's important to believe. They believe in belief more than they actually believe what they say they believe. I think that there are non-believers out there who are non-believers in bad faith who in their heart of hearts don't really believe or don't really not believe. They sort of in their heart of hearts think, yeah, there's probably a God, but you know. And I say that because I can remember going through that phase myself when I was religious and as a young man, very young man, and I fell out of religion when I was sort of about 16, 17. I just sort of fell out of it, so I was pretty tender. But I can remember going through a period where I couldn't really bring myself to believe anymore. It just didn't feel serious. But you know, I'd lie in bed at night, and sort of old habits die hard. You know, you're a Christian. You pray before you go to sleep, and I could remember. I'm embarrassed to say this in a way, but I can remember having to will myself not to pray because I had determined, no, I don't believe, and I have to be consistent. I don't believe, and I would feel this impulse bubble up in me, this habit, right? And so some part of me still felt, oh, you know, maybe there's a God. You better cover your bases, and I would fight, you know, with myself to not pray, you know, and to not act on religious impulses and stuff like that. And of course, you know, you get past that. But it would be like quitting smoking or anything, you know, it is any habit. But you know, a religious person is going to look at that and say, oh, Ozzy, you know, that was, you know, the spirit was knocking on you there, was, you know, just hitting you on the heart there, and you were just turning your back on God, you know, there was the evidence, you know, and you missed it. You turned your back on God.
Just like the god of addiction is knocking on your heart every time you...
Yeah.
Yeah, whatever. Every time you're jonesing for a fix of whatever it is you're addicted to, the god of addiction is knocking on your heart and you're denying him. You should let him in. Anywho. On that note, I'm gonna wrap this up. It's been about a little under 2 hours, and I think that we've kind of sussed out the riches that C.S. Lewis has presented to us in Mere Christianity. I very much want to thank, or at least the first chapter in Mere Christianity. What I would like to do is, in a better way, go over chapter 2, such that there are no technical difficulties. At another time, maybe make an event, maybe in the new year, because the holidays are coming up. But after the new year, maybe take care of chapter 2 and do it in a similar fashion to this, such that we can view chapter 2. Steve has, an atheist reads Mere Christianity. There are only 3 or 4 chapters, maybe 5 in Mere Christianity. Steve, how many?
There are 4. It's divided into 4 books, and I think I did 6 episodes on it because a few of the books I divided in 2. So.
Okay, so I would love to do chapter 2. We were covering chapter 1 tonight. If we were to do chapter 2 in the new year, we would watch like about an hour episode that Steve already has, and then we would invite Steve back for another hang similar to this. And of the 41 people that are watching right now, I would invite you to be part of the hang. Don't just be viewers, be contributors. Come on and participate. I see that a lot of people are commenting, and for those people that are commenting, take the next step. Be a part of the hang. We would very much like for you to be a part of this. And I would like very much to give some shout-outs to everybody in the New Covenant group that I know is pushing really hard to make this event as popular as it is. So Christopher Hitchslap, thank you very much for pushing this as hard as you did. Dr. Jones, thank you very much. I know Alex Greco very much wanted to be a part of this but was unable to. He's a big fan of yours, Steve. And, of course, I want to thank Ilana. I would like to thank Ozzy. I would like to thank Steve Shives for taking time out of their evening tonight to talk about the things that we discussed. You all rock my fat ass, and I would hope that you would come back next year to cover chapter 2 or book 2 of C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. So, for those of you that are unfamiliar with the fact that New Covenant Group has all-day Sunday programming on Ustream as well as on YouTube. We also have a Facebook page called The Cult of Honesty where we do most of our promoting. Please head yourselves towards that page, friend us up, become a part of it, participate, join the conversation. That being said, everybody have an awesome night. Take care.